Hello everybody, welcome back. Look at me, I finished reading a book. You have no idea how the irony hangs on my shoulders that here I am doing a whole channel about reading and it takes me so long to actually finish a book. I would like to make excuses for that, but it is what it is. I distract myself. Nevertheless, we are talking today about The Secret History by Donna Tartt. This is the book that I just finished. I picked this book up because a student of mine used it for an extended essay, which if you're not familiar with the IB diploma program, it is a 4,000 word research essay that you have to do. And this student chose this book to write about, kind of looking at the classical allusions that are being made to it. And it was really good. It was a very nicely done essay. And in talking with the student about their work, they said, you got to read this book. And so I decided to do it. So you're welcome. Or thank you. Not sure which one. Nevertheless, I have read the book. I know it is very popular amongst a certain kind of sect of readers. It's got its own subreddit, which is pretty interesting. And to sort of look at the level of involvement that people have with the book, both in sort of kind of surface level interaction, like, for example, fan casting the book, which is always fun, but also getting into really, really deeper issues of the book and sort of what Donna Tartt is trying to get at. So there's a very dedicated fan base. I have a weird aversion to fandoms, but nevertheless, I think I liked the book. I did like the book. I have a few, nits to pick, certainly, but I enjoyed the read. So what is The Secret History? The Secret History is you learn right at the beginning what it's about, which is a group of college students who murder one of their own. You find this out on page 1. This is not a spoiler. But there's a group of college students. They go to a fictional New England college, Hampton College, and they are all sort of classics students working under this elder statesman teacher named Julian. And they study ancient Greek and Latin and Roman texts and great plays and philosophy. They study in a sort of a separate building that's called the Lyceum. They don't really hang out with other students and teachers very much. They're kind of on their own. And the 6 of them, they study together, and they seem to be good friends, really good friends, until, like I said, one of them they kind of murder one of them. So the story is told from the point of view of the new kid, this kid Richard. And Richard is interesting. Well, no, I'm going to take that back. Richard is actually not interesting. And I'll get to that in a second. But Richard is from California. He studied Greek on a whim, really liked it, and then transferred to Hampton hopefully he studied Greek in the classics, but that was going to be a rough step for him. And he ends up entering this group as the new kid, right? Everybody else kind of already knows each other, and they, the classic sort of outsider story, right? He has to prove himself to them. He has to prove that he belongs there. They're already kind of a tight-knit group, and he's sort of on the outside. And so he narrates this whole thing to us about himself and getting used to living away from home, getting used to living with a bunch of really, really rich kids, right? So all the other kids in his class are exceptional in some way. They are all generally quite wealthy, quite well off. They don't need a scholarship to go here. They don't have parents who refuse to pay for college. They don't have to have a part-time job. They can just jet off to Europe if they want to do, right? So I think one of the defining characteristics of Richard is that he is, one of these things is unlike the other, and he feels that constantly throughout. The other thing that is a defining characteristic of Richard, which he tells us, he tells us that his fatal flaw, because again, he's a classics student, his fatal flaw is a morbid longing for the picturesque at all costs, right? He wants to see the beauty of things. But I don't think that's his fatal flaw. His fatal flaw is that he makes stuff up. And he says that, page 25, if there's one thing I'm good at, it's lying on my feet. It's sort of a gift that I have. So right away, we need to be very, very wary of Richard as a narrator. We don't know what he is. We don't know about what he's telling us or what he's not telling us. And I think that's going to be very, very important. So as I said, it starts out, we know that they have murdered one of their own. So there are 6 students. As I said, we got Richard, distant, kind of needy, an unreliable narrator. We've got Bunny, who's this sort of Kennedy family-esque, really annoying, very sort of expensive friend, the kind of friend who's going to take you out to an expensive lunch and then say, oh, I forgot my wallet. Could you cover this? And quite unpleasant in a lot of ways. He's extraordinarily homophobic. He's generally disregards other people's boundaries. He's not a very good person. There's Francis, who is, I like to think of as class unconscious. He doesn't realize that poor people are a thing. In a way, he's not a bad person, but he's not like that. Very, very privileged. We have Henry, who's extremely manipulative and cold, but has a very, very sort of magnetic personality, right? Everybody is drawn to Henry, and that becomes kind of important throughout the book. We've got Charles and Camilla, who are twins. Charles is very kind of temperamental, and by the end of the story, is extraordinarily drunk and belligerent. Camilla's rather aloof and manipulative. We don't really get to learn a whole lot about her, and I think there's a reason why. I think because as we go through the book, we learn that Richard's really got a thing for Camilla. And I suspect, again, if we're assuming he's an unreliable narrator, I suspect he's leaving stuff out in order to portray Camilla in the best light that he can, right? Because that's his way of sort of signaling his love for her, even if he can't be with her, that sort of thing. And then there's Julian, who is the teacher who runs this lyceum. And I'll be honest with you, when I started reading this, I really thought that Julian was going to turn out to be like a cult leader, right? That the murder they talk about at the beginning of the book was going to be on Julian Say-So, because that's the kind of person he is presented to us as. This very eccentric, strange teacher who only picks a few students a year, who seems extraordinarily polite, but is, very, very good at walling off his students from the rest of the school, right? It's got all the hallmarks of some sort of cult leader. But no, he's not like that, actually. He's disappointing. And I think, and again, Richard, at the right time in the book, Richard brings that up to him as well, is that Julian had a lot of promise in terms of who he was, but in the end, he turned out to be a disappointment. So, but yeah, we learn on page 1 that Bunny is murdered. They kill him. No problem. And then there's a whole lot of stuff about Richard and his life and his fitting into Hampton and sort of who he is and how he sees the world. And there's a very bad winter where he nearly freezes to death. And, writing about his sort of distance and detachment from the other kids. And frankly, I wasn't that interested in that bit because I was promised a murder at the top of the show. And I really wanted to know what the murder was. And honestly, Tartt did a very good job of presenting Bunny as a deeply unpleasant person to begin with. So, after the first few chapters, I'm like, yeah, of course, why not kill Bunny? Go for it. But of course, it gets more complicated than that, right? They don't just wake up one day and go, you know what? Bunny's kind of a jerk and he costs us money. Let's kill him. I'm not saying it's justified, really. A lot of what they do, there is sort of an inciting incident to this, which Richard is not part of, right? One of the things that is definitely clear about this whole book is that the other 5, or 4 eventually, don't really see Richard as necessarily one of them. They see him as somebody that they can use and make use of, and he's great to have around, but he's not really one of them, right? Because at a certain point, Henry decides that he wants to have a bacchanalia, right? He's read the Bacchae of Euripides. He's read all these classic texts, and again, early in the book, we are presented with this idea that the Greeks, one of the things that they sort of were interested in was this sense of losing control, right? They were so enwrapped in being, rationally correct. They had a morbid fascination with what happens when the rational mind is disposed of, when Dionysus enters and you enter the frenzy, which you are no longer in control of. And this sense that you can give up this tight, rigidly held order in your life, which Henry is very much an example of that. He's a very, very controlled and controlling person. And he decides, I want to have a bacchanalia. I want to have I want to be able to do what they do. So they research it and they go out and they do it. And by all accounts, it works. They do kind of go into the frenzy state. But of course, something terrible happens. And the problem isn't so much what the terrible thing, the problem is the cover-up. And, Bunny starts to get wind of what happened. He becomes kind of a loose end and a problem. Why Richard isn't a loose end and a problem, I don't know. They do try to hide it from him, but nevertheless, they suspect that Bunny's going to maybe slip and turn them in. And so they decide, it's time to murder Bunny. And that's, for me, when things got interesting, right? I get it. Richard is a new kid on the block. Richard's the new kid at school. People might not like him very much. Fine, whatever. But I felt that got slow. That was where I had a hard time picking the book up again and continuing to read, is because I don't think Richard's a very interesting character. And again, that may be intentional, that the character of Richard, in telling this story some years later, is trying to diminish his own role in all the events that transpire. And he's trying to make the other students more interesting than he is, because I found him kind of, honestly, dull. That's just how I felt. I was like, all right, there's not a whole lot to really make him stand out. He doesn't have the flamboyancy or the personality of everybody else. He's just sort of there reacting to what happens. Yeah, for a lot of it, I was like, I was promised a murder. I want a murder. And then finally things start to roll. Things start to happen, right? We learn about the Bacchanalia. They start to plan to do away with Bunny. I'm like, okay, finally, we're doing good stuff. And once that happens, the story picks up. Because the murder itself, as I said, we know about that from the beginning of the book. The murder itself is not terribly exciting. In fact, I don't really think we get to see the murder except in flashback later. The fun stuff is, of course, the cover-up. How do you hide that it happens? How do you keep people from suspecting you? How do you keep people from talking? How do you keep the FBI or the police or Bunny's extraordinarily wealthy family and friends from finding out that you were the one? How do you go to Bunny's funeral and keep a straight face? How do you go back to class with your teacher who taught the six of you and pretend to not know what happened to one of your classmates, right? That, for me, is where the story got really interesting. And, of course, the stress that puts on the group begins to break them, because they are not the most stable of people to begin with. And each one of them begins to break in different ways, either mentally or physically or socially. They start to break down. And we see this all through Richard's eyes. And one of the neat things is that they try very hard, maybe out of pity, maybe out of sympathy, maybe because they need one normal person. They try very hard to keep a lot of this from Richard. They try to keep him on the outside of what's going on. And Richard kind of gets drawn into things by chance and happenstance. You really do get the feeling, I get the feeling through all of this, that Richard would have been much happier had he never entered this group. He could have still come to Hampton. It's a lovely college. I mean, New England is a great place to go to school. But if he had never joined this group, I think Richard would have been fine. He would have had a lovely time. He could have just studied Greek in his off time, and he would have had friends, and he could have had drunk and done drugs, because that's what these kids do. But yeah, you do get the feeling that this was not a waste of time necessarily for Richard, but it was a bad choice. And he could have made a lot of better choices. But a lot of choices were made kind of for him by all of the other Lyceum students. And so the sort of fallout of the murder is this slow crumbling and collapsing where, number one, everyone's trying to help the people who are falling apart, but at the same time, the undertone of it is like, okay, this guy's getting drunk all the time and becoming really kind of belligerent and a jerk. We care about him and we want to help him, but at the same time, we also don't want him to talk about the murder. Are we going to have to shove someone else off a cliff? I don't know, right? So that's, for me, where things got really interesting. So, my overall thoughts on the book. It was good, and I have a feeling it is one of those books that is going to benefit from a reread, because, as I said, Tartt tells us at the very beginning of the book that a murder happens. And then we learn that the Lyceum students are keeping Richard out of a lot of their plans and plots. And I think knowing what all those plans and plots are now that I've finished the book, reading it from the beginning again might be more revealing, because I can start to better understand the places where Richard is kept in isolation and where Richard is kept out of sort of the game. Again, for me, it's an odd choice. It's an odd writing choice, honestly, to keep your point of view character out of the action for the most part. And I kind of asked myself why Donna Tartt did that. And possibly because, as with a lot of stories like this, the story isn't really about the murder. The story is about what happens to the group in the aftermath of the murder. And having Richard as kind of a semi-detached observer of all of this allows Tartt to kind of tell the story without making it about Richard. And as I said at the beginning, Richard is not really a reliable narrator. At one point in the story, when he's talking about Julian, he says, I really wanted to make Julian look better in this story. I really wanted to make Julian be, a better figure, but I couldn't, and I couldn't lie that way. And the sort of inference that you make when you're reading it is that, well, maybe he could have for other people, right? That maybe he did for other people. Maybe he left out elements of their behavior or their personality or their involvement in order to portray them in a certain light. And you wonder to yourself, by the end of it, you're like, well, how involved was Richard? Was he really just sort of the fly on the wall character? Was there more that we're not being told? And I think for people who are interested in kind of digging out this information, again, you go back to the beginning and you start to reread it and start to maybe pick things out and go, wait a minute, this is inconsistent with this. Richard is not telling us the truth about something. And I have a feeling for a dedicated reader who really likes putting those pieces together, I suspect, yeah, there is definitely a lot available for a reread. So I enjoyed it. I'm glad that I read it. And I think at some point I may read it again. I'll make sure I dig out my notes and read it again. Yeah, the characters are interesting and largely unlikable. Richard is untrustworthy and not very interesting as a person, but the story in totality, please don't let me put this off. The story in totality is good. And I enjoyed it a lot. I have to go back and reread my student's essay again to see if I can pick up what they were talking about in there and see if I noticed that, because maybe I didn't. But yeah, The Secret History. If you've read it, and there's a very good chance that you have, because it is a really popular book. If you've read it and you've got thoughts, please put them down in the comments. I would love to hear from you. I'd love to talk more about this, right? If there's a whole lot of discussion going on, I may do a follow-up video and talk about some of the ideas that are presented, because, hey, I miss stuff. I've only read it once, and it took me a long time. I didn't do the read through the whole thing in a weekend thing like I used to do when I was younger, and I had an attention span. So, thank you very much for coming around. I really appreciate it. I'm glad I finished the book. I've got a couple more books in the pipeline. I've started reading them in parallel, which I don't think is a very good idea. I'll try to stop that, but nevertheless, thanks for coming around. Thanks for listening to me ramble about The Secret History. I enjoyed it. I hope you liked it. I hope you like and subscribe and all that stuff. You knew that was coming, didn't you? Yes, you did. All right. So yeah, I will see you for the next video. Stay well.